This episode of Tools for the Future is all about color. I made this with my good friend Maria Judice, so she also deserves credit. I also owe a deep debt of gratitude to Judy Crook, who taught me color theory so many years ago as an undergraduate. She knew more about color than anyone I've ever met. As with most of design, color is partly focused on our physical reality, the world in which we find ourselves, governed by chemistry and physics, and partly about how our human eyes work. Eyes from other animals can work very differently and see differently from us, including color. Design guidelines and expectations would be very different for other animals than what has evolved for us, for instance. Therefore, how we see determines some component of what is seen as appropriate or successful design, at least for humans. This is how most of us are taught to think about colors when we're children. It's not inaccurate, but it's pretty incomplete. It's also not very precise. For example, when we say color in this context, we usually mean hue or chroma, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Complementary colors, for example, are opposite on the color spectrum. These tend to be popular because their opposition creates contrast and energy. This is often why we see them used for sports teams. There are other color combinations like split complements. These often work because they give us more complex options while they also preserve the contrast and energy of opposing colors. And if we split the colors on both ends of a complementary set, we get what's called a double split comp or a tetrad. Splitting both sides keeps the energy, increases the complexity even more, but also starts to reduce the contrast, especially if the colors are used unevenly. They do retain a sense of visual balance, but that's not always what is important about a composition anyway. Triadic color combinations also strive for visual balance, but in a different way. So far, these are all color combinations in one dimension, going around the color spectrum. These relationships are simple, and if this dimension were our only option, we would have much fewer colors and combinations to work with. Certainly, we can do a lot with this one dimension. Monochromatic scenes, for example, can emphasize different aspects of an image or set a specific kind of mood in a way that no color or chroma actually does in real life. Duotones, too, set the scene, but with very narrow color options. But color is at least three-dimensional in reality, which gives us trillions of colors and combinations. We'll need to explore these other dimensions, however, if we're going to make use of them successfully. Before we get into these other two dimensions, there's something else we need to address. There are actually two different kinds of color systems, light and pigment. Colored light mixes the opposite of how colored pigments mix. When we add colored lights together, for example, they mix to make white. This is called additive color, though we're adding light, not pigment, so it seems backwards to how most of us experience color. You're actually familiar with these phenomena already. Your television and your computer screens operate with light, so they're additive color systems. All of the colored objects you encounter, from toys and fabrics to paintings and drawings, or printed books and magazines, all of these things are created with pigments, so they're subtractive color systems. This means that when you add colors together in pigments, they mix to form brown or black. There are several variations of these too, but they all fall into these categories: light and pigment. The most common additive system is called RGB because it can create nearly every color we can think of from just these three colored light sources, specific shades of red, green, and blue lights. There are also different subtractive systems, many more in fact, because they use different kinds and combinations of pigments to create as many colors as possible. The reason why there are so many different kinds of tubes of artist paints, for example, is that many of these use different minerals to create their color. For instance, titanium white or cobalt blue. One of the most common color systems for printing is called CMYK because it creates most colors with only 4 specific pigments: cyan, a specific kind of blue; magenta, a very specific red; yellow; and black. That's what the K stands for, so that we don't confuse the B in black for blue. This is really efficient. Although CMYK can't reproduce every color the human eye can see, it can hit most of them, certainly enough for most uses, with just these 4 pigments instead of dozens and dozens we would need otherwise. Now this is where things will get a little bit more complex. But remember, you already recognize all these colors whether or not you realize how they work. These are the 3 dimensions of color. In addition to the color spectrum we had before, we've added 2 other dimensions of color. Recognize that these were always there, just not on that reduced color wheel. The colors we saw before revolving around a wheel have been filled in towards the center with more colors that gradiate to white. Each step from the outside to the inside gets a little less colorful, meaning they start to appear more gray until there's no color left at all. This dimension is called saturation. From the inside to the outside of this 3-dimensional color diagram, the colors get more saturated as you move to the outside. We call the colors on the outside saturated and the ones towards the interior less saturated. Recognize that there's a hard limit or boundary on the outside of the color spectrum where there are just no more colors, there's no more saturation to be had, which is to say that the hue can't get any more saturated. It's reached the limits of that hue. The last of the 2 dimensions is that depth represented by the block moving down. This dimension is called value and moves from light to dark. At the very center of the block, this line moves literally from white to black. But try to understand this is just light to dark. For any other vertical line in the diagram at any other point, it doesn't start from white and go to black. It starts at a specific light version of a color and moves to a darker one of the same hue. These 3 dimensions describe nearly everything we know and see in terms of color. However, this is a really idealized view. The reality is a little bit different, but keep this model in mind. In reality, these colors actually represent different frequencies of light that our eyes can see. Since they're natural phenomenon, there are natural variations that don't fit the ideal. So the idealized drum is more of a tetrahedron that is pushed out of shape in places. This makes a lot of sense when you think about it. Yellows at high saturation are lighter and brighter than purples. You can't really get light violets without adding white and pushing them towards the center of the color blob. This takes saturation out of them. So this misshapen cube or drum simply reflects the reality of physics and light in nature, as well as the reality of our biology and how our eyes see. It's perfectly okay that it's not ideal. The difference between the ideal and the real allows us to compare different color systems. For example, if we plot the visible color space, again, in the ideal, it's not really a perfect circle. Different real color systems can only create a subset of these idealized colors. Imagine a slice of the drum midway through it. These are some of the most popular color systems, both RGB that we mentioned before, which uses colored lights, and CMYK and Pantone, which use systems with different pigments. None of these systems can reproduce all of the possible visible colors. That's why they have their different uses. If you have specialized color needs, you may need to use a specific color system different from the others to reproduce those colors. Likewise, if you're designing for a specific medium, like digital screens, you need to work in and specify colors in a compatible color system. If you're choosing and specifying colors in Pantone or CMYK, for example, like a print designer might, you're using a much more constrained color space and may be specifying colors that can't be accurately reproduced on a screen at all. Notice that little overlap between RGB and Pantone, for example. Also, if you need to specify colors that have to be reproduced across color systems, perhaps a corporate color used in a corporate identity that needs to look the same on printed materials as well as screens, for example, you should stick to those colors in the overlap between those color spaces. There are several different pigment systems that create different color spaces for different purposes. Pantone and Folkotone, True Match, etc. This is because of the physicality of color pigments. You can't always use the same pigments to color a water-based paint and an oil-based one. Or when you're trying to make a plastic part emerge from the production process to match the color on the printed packaging, you may need different pigments to do each. All of these different color systems need translations back and forth in order to align them. This is the reality of color in the physical world. Now let's leave the ideal and talk about nature and how our eyes work so we can learn to use color effectively. We need to put color into context. To start with, we don't actually see the hue or chroma first. In fact, our eyes work in such a way that we don't see any of the three color dimensions first. The first thing that registers to our eyes is actually motion or change. So sometimes this is a much more impactful design decision than those around color at all. This is why motion in your peripheral vision can be so distracting. Our eyes have evolved to prioritize things that move, either to help us eat or to help keep us safe. For some animals, in fact, they can't see at all if things aren't moving. Their eyes only register movement and not static scenes. For instance, if you're building an interface for dolphins, the interface needs to be in motion at all times. But let's stick to humans for now. The next thing our eye sees is value, or the differences between light and dark. We have 5 million cones, which are hue receptors in our eyes, but we have 120 million rods, which are value receptors. That's nearly 60 times more rods than cones in our eyes, so value has a lot more impact. Together, these rods allow us to differentiate about 750 different values. That's pretty fine sensitivity. This is why graphic designers usually design in monochrome or black and white. Traditionally, if it doesn't work in value alone, it very well may not work at all. Colors and design can encounter all sorts of problems when we consider these other factors if it's not working on this one level to begin with. Designing icons and logos to work first in black and white, for example, ensures that they'll work in many different contexts, color systems, and across devices and applications. We see actual hues, color, last, and remember, we have less sensitivity since we don't have as many cones as we do rods. So to design effectively in color, we need to pay attention to the factors that our eyes see most, motion and value, and then hue and saturation. In this way, it's helpful to always remember that color, as we use to design things, is really the reaction our eyes have to the physical reality of color or specific wavelengths of light. It's not enough to differentiate or obsess over that reality as much as how humans react to it. So the ideal isn't as important as the real. Our eyes are always reacting to the physical reality, but not always in the ways that we expect or prefer. Color, therefore, is the interaction between light or photons and pigment or atoms, and our ability to see and understand them. This makes color theory much more interesting than simply optimizing the use of color coordinates. While light operates on the same electromagnetic spectrum as sound, but at different frequencies, our perception of color brings in many more factors that influence the appropriate or successful use of color. Color, then, is all about context, the physical, the perceptual, and the cultural. For example, the oranges in these two squares are exactly the same color, but their contexts are different. The interplay between the orange with the red surrounding it is different than that of the orange with the green surrounding it. This makes us see different colors. Our eyes literally contextualize them differently and can lead us to different conclusions. This was explained in detail by the artist Joseph Albers, and many artists have used these simple interplays as the basis of powerful art. However, these are really simple examples. Imagine how much more complex the context might become. For example, is this purple square warm or cool? Which are two different ways that we use to describe color. Is it a warm color or a cool one? What if we change the concept? Is it still warm or cool? When the context changes, the perception of it changes. So does our understanding. This too can change our decisions about color. To many, the purple color here looks cooler than the red. But here the context is changed, so the understanding and perception can too. Most people would say that the purple is warmer than the blue. So warm and cool are relative like everything else about color. The same color can be both a warm one and a cool one, depending on the context. Warm and cool can also refer to more than just the absolute colors themselves. For example, colors that are in stark contrast in an illustration or a scene, think about how the sun shines at noon, seem warmer than not. Likewise, colors that lack stark contrast, regardless of what those colors actually are, can be seen as cooler. Think of a hazy morning light. So scenes can be warm or cool and therefore evoke very different feelings regardless of the absolute colors of the subject. In general, in nature, warm light is brighter, more orange, casts more distinct shadows, is harsher, and causes higher contrast. Cooler light tends to be softer, bluer, fuzzier, and lower contrast. Sometimes these differences are called active and inactive instead of warm and cool, which are kind of stupid adjectives in this sense, but they mean the same things. Complicating matters even further are the surface treatments of materials that have certain colors. For example, metallic colors look completely different than non-metallic ones, even of the same hue, chroma, and value. This is because they have small microscopic particles suspended in their paint that reflect light in a different way than flat color or even shiny color. There are many kinds of effects of this. For instance, you've probably seen on occasion cars or other products with a pearl paint job. These are paints that have microscopic spheres of glass embedded in the paint so that the sun casts a different reflection on the surface, changing the colors in dramatic ways. In this example, the nose of the car is not painted a light blue and then a lighter purple and then a darker purple. This car is painted with the same color throughout, but depending on how the surface is oriented to the sun or a light source differently, shapes the color that we see reflected off of it. Another example of colors that have attributes beyond the standard 3 dimensions are neon or radiating colors, colors that radiate light. It's very often possible to create colors that pigment systems could never create. Think back to that diagram of different color systems and how many colors fell outside of the color pigment systems that were still in visible light. This is one of my favorite examples because most people don't realize that butterflies and moths and other kinds of insects don't actually have color. They don't have pigments creating the colors that we see. What's creating the color in this butterfly are microscopic prismatic structures in the wing itself that reflect light in specific ways and reflect different wavelengths of light. So if you were to step on this butterfly by accident, you wouldn't see a bunch of orange pigment in the mess that was left over. You would only see probably blacks and grays because there is no pigment in the butterfly itself. What we're seeing is how light gets trapped and bounced around in certain wavelengths on the surface of the butterfly in the same way that we see effects of color that are dramatically different in metallic or pearl paint jobs. So a butterfly's colors are created completely with little tricks of reflected light. Even diet can affect color perception. For example, vitamin A stimulates the infrared, which helps us see in the dark. And our eye lens is not actually color corrected. There's something called chromostereopsis, which basically means that our eye focuses different colors and different frequencies of light at different focal distances. This means that reds appear closer to us than blues, which appear more distant. Now, I'll admit that these effects are pretty minor, and we've gotten used to them over time. Also, over time, our lens is yellow, which makes it harder to distinguish these blues, which means it makes it harder for us to distinguish depth. If we force a change in the interplay in color, we can get a sense of how this chromostereopsis works, but the effect is still really subtle. As I said before, as we age, our color perception changes as well. Our lens is yellow, which means it's difficult to distinguish blues, and it's difficult to judge the same depth. And of course, there are a percentage of people in the population that have varying types of color blindness. Not that they're blind to color, but that they don't pick up subtle differences between all colors. These are things that we should keep in mind if we hope that our products are usable by as many people as possible. Color also has meaning. These things are outside of the color frequencies and the physics of color and have everything to do with the culture of color And of course, every culture has different meanings for color. For example, the color red often represents love or warning or hot or prosperity. Red is a very hot color, meaning it's associated with fire, sometimes with violence, sometimes with warfare. It's also associated with love and passion. In history, it's been associated with both the devil and Cupid. Red can actually have a physical effect on people, raising blood pressure and respiration rates. It's been shown to enhance human metabolism as well. Red can be associated with anger, but it's also associated with importance. Think of the red carpet at an awards show and celebrity events. Red also indicates danger. The reason stoplights and signs are red, and the reason most warning labels are red, for instance. Outside the Western world, red has different associations as well. In China, for example, red is the color of prosperity and happiness. It can also be used to attract good luck. In other Eastern cultures, red is sometimes worn by brides on their wedding days. In South Africa, however, red is the color of mourning, at least traditionally. Red is also associated with communism. Red has become the color associated with AIDS awareness in Africa due to the popularity of the Red campaign. In design, red can be a powerful accent color. It can have an overwhelming effect if it's used too much in designs, especially in its purest form. It's a great color to use when power or passion want to be portrayed in the design. Orange is a very vibrant and energetic color as well. In its muted forms, it can be associated with the earth and with autumn. Because of its association with the changing seasons, orange can represent change and movement in general. Orange is also strongly associated with creativity and change. Because orange is associated with the fruit of the same name, it can be associated with health and vitality. In designs, orange commands attention without being as overpowering as red. It's often considered more friendly and inviting and less in your face than red. Yellow is often considered the brightest and most energizing of the warm colors. It's associated often with happiness and sunshine. Yellow can be associated with deceit and cowardice, though. Calling someone yellow is to call them a coward in Western culture. Yellow is associated with hope, as it can be seen in some countries when yellow ribbons are displayed by families who have loved ones at war. Yellow is also associated with danger, though not as strongly as red. In some countries, yellow has a very different connotation. In Egypt, for example, yellow is for mourning. In Japan, it represents courage, and in India, it's a color for merchants. In your designs, bright yellow can lend a sense of happiness and cheerfulness. Softer yellows are commonly used as a gender-neutral color for babies, for example, rather than blue or pink. Light yellows also give more calm feeling of happiness than bright yellows. Dark yellows and gold-hued yellows can sometimes look antique and be used in designs where a sense of permanence is desired. Green is a very down-to-earth color, as you can imagine. It can represent new beginnings and growth. It also signifies renewal and abundance. Alternatively, green can also represent envy or jealousy and a lack of experience. Green has many of the same calming attributes that blue has, but it also incorporates some of the energy of yellow. In design, green can have a balancing and harmonizing effect and is very stable. It's appropriate for designs related to wealth or abundance, stability, renewal, and nature. Brighter greens are more energizing and vibrant, while olive greens are more representative of the natural world, and dark greens are the most stable and representative of affluence. Blue can be associated with sadness in the English language. Blue is also used extensively to represent calmness and responsibility. Light blues can be refreshing and friendly. Dark blues can be more strong and reliable. Blue is also associated with peace and has spiritual and religious connotations in many cultures and traditions. For example, the Virgin Mary is generally depicted wearing blue robes. The meaning of blue is widely affected depending on the exact shade and hue. In design, the exact shade of blue you select will have a huge impact on how your designs are perceived. Light blues are often relaxed and calming. Bright blues can be energizing and refreshing. Dark blues, like navy, are excellent for corporate sites or designs where strength and reliability are important. Of course, blue is often associated with business, and many business corporate identities and logos use some shade of blue or another as their primary color. But blue is also probably the most common color found in nature. More people on the planet see blue regularly than probably any other color. And I know that there aren't a lot of blue fruits or blue flowers or blue plants, certainly not blue animals, but think for a moment the most prevalent thing in nature and what color it is. That's the sky. And nearly everyone on the planet sees the sky every day, and most often it's some shade of blue. People may not be near water, they may live in the desert where there isn't a lot of vegetation, they may not see plants terribly often, but nearly everyone can look to the sky and see blue. In some ways, blue is the most natural color of all. Neutral colors can serve as the backdrops in design. They're commonly combined with brighter accent colors, for instance, but they can also be used on their own in designs and create very sophisticated layouts. The meanings and impressions of neutral colors are much more affected by the colors that surround them than, let's say, warm or cool colors are. And then there's black. Black is often seen as sophisticated or elegant or mysterious. Black can be the color of death in some cultures and the color of abundance or importance in others. In many ways, black is the absence of color, which can make it scary, but is also the most neutral backdrop to place anything on for the highest contrast. Gray is a neutral color. Generally, the grays that we see most often are on the cooler end of the spectrum. They tend towards blue a bit. But there's no reason why gray can't be on the warmer end of the spectrum and tend towards yellows or oranges or reds. Light grays can be used in place of white in some designs, especially if you want something white to pop off the background, and dark grays can be used in place of black. Gray is generally conservative and formal, but can also be very modern. It's sometimes considered a color of mourning. It's commonly used in corporate designs where formality and professionalism are key. It can be a very sophisticated color traditionally. Pure grays are shades of black, though other grays may have blue or brown hues mixed in. In design, gray backgrounds are very common, as is gray typography. So our personal cultures and societal cultures really affect our perceptions of color. This means that color has different meanings and triggers different meanings in different people. For instance, what's the color of success? Some people, especially in the United States, think of green as the color of success because that's the color of money in the United States. But we have to keep in mind that money isn't green in other cultures. So the same assumptions we make about transmitting meaning through color don't often translate in other cultures or in other languages. What does pink signify? For some, it signifies femininity. For others, it goes beyond femininity into preciousness or royalty. And of course, in the United States, we have very different associations to pink as well. Certainly, Owens Corning Fiberglass is very happy that pink is often associated with their products. Think about how color represents people. Is this representative of you? Is this? What about these? How we characterize things in design affects how people identify with them. And the context, of course, changes our awareness of this as well. It's one thing to represent people in very simple color choices, but the moment we step off of that simplicity, we step into a world of variety that becomes very important. Color coding is a way of assigning meaning to color, and this can be very useful in helping us identify things, tag things, categorize things, arrange, organize, and present things. But those colors may have different meanings to different people. Perhaps you've heard of the hanky code, for instance. This was a code in gay bars in major Western cities, especially in the United States, back in the 60s and 70s. The idea was that different colored hankies worn in the back pocket, either on the left or right, signified different preferences. You can look up the hanky code online and see that there's now a ridiculous number of variations, colored shades and differences that are way too subtle to most people to be able to discern any meaning, let alone in a dark bar. But I find it really interesting that a community would go so far as to categorize behaviors and preferences using just color and placement. At the root of it, color can even help or hinder life. For instance, the color of certain algae or bacteria affects how much growth can occur. Hopefully you understand color a little bit more about its organization and how it works with the eye, and hopefully you feel a little more confident in using color. Thank you.